The training ground orbiting the amber gas giant looked almost peaceful from a distance, a ring of pale metal drifting against the enormous swirl of storms. Up close, the place felt more like a crucible than a campus. The central courtyard was a wide circle of gray stone scarred by countless drills, bordered by low barracks, workshops, and the open-air pavilions where instructors usually barked orders. Today, though, the courtyard itself was the classroom. Alien cadets of all kinds clustered around the marked lines in the stone, chattering in a mix of languages, colorful uniforms catching the cold light of the distant sun. Mark adjusted the strap of his training pack and stepped into the circle, feeling the familiar weight of dozens of curious eyes on his back. He had grown used to that gaze, half suspicion, half fascination. The only human among the candidates at the Interstellar Survival Academy would attract attention no matter what he did. He tried not to think about it as he took his place behind one of the white lines and planted his boots, drawing a long breath that tasted faintly of ozone and metal as the atmospheric shields hummed overhead. Across the circle, a tall instructor in dark uniform strode onto the central platform. Her uniform bore the silver insignia of Senior Field Command, and the edges of her cape fluttered subtly in the artificial breeze generated by the shield emitters. Her skin had a faint violet sheen, and her eyes were a sharp metallic gold that swept across the crowd like searchlights. The cadets fell quiet almost instantly. Mark felt the silence settle, as if the entire courtyard had taken a breath and was now holding it. He had seen Instructor Vesha before, during a lecture about hostile environments and the many creative ways in which an unprepared cadet could die. She did not believe in sugarcoating reality, and she did not believe in second chances. "Cadets," she said, her voice amplified by the discrete field projectors mounted around the courtyard. "Today you begin the minimal gear survival evaluation." The words dropped like stones into still water. A few cadets shifted uneasily, others straightened with forced confidence. Mark kept his eyes on her, watching her posture, her expression, the slight tightness at the corner of her mouth that told him she was not just delivering a routine exercise. This mattered to her. He had learned early on that if something mattered to the instructors, it should matter to him as well. A maintenance drone glided onto the platform behind her, carrying a stack of objects in its magnetic field. At first, Mark thought the objects were dull metal discs, but as the drone rotated, he saw the rounded sides and open tops. Pots. Identical, deep metal pots, each big enough to cook a decent meal in, each sturdy enough to be used as an improvised hammer. The drone stopped at the center of the platform and hovered there, humming softly, while the morning light glinted off the polished rims. A murmur rippled through the cadets. Mark heard snippets of comments from nearby. One reptilian cadet whispered that the pots looked too small to hold proper rations, while another complained that he had expected something more advanced, some clever multi-purpose tool. To most of them, the pot looked disappointingly simple. Instructor Vesha raised one hand, and the murmurs died. "For this evaluation," she said, "each of you will be issued one pot. No other tools will be provided. You may use what you find in the environment. You may work within your assigned zones. You may not share equipment. Your success or failure will depend on what you can imagine doing with this single object." She gestured to the hovering drone. "This pot will be your firebox, your container, your shield, your burden. Treat it as dead weight, and it will drag you down. Treat it as a foundation, and it may keep you alive." Mark felt something in his chest click into place as she spoke. One pot. No other tools. That was the sort of constraint that made the problem interesting. His mind immediately began to sort through possibilities, not as a neat list, but as a scatter of images and memories. His grandfather stirring a heavy cast-iron pot over a campfire, condensation beating on a lid and dripping back into the stew. Improvised solar stills from old survival manuals, a video he had watched as a teenager of someone digging a pit, lining it with stones, and using a metal container as a crude crucible. He pictured boiling water until it steamed, redirecting that steam through cloth, using the same vessel to render fat, to mix clay, to melt metal. The pot would be heavy but durable, a central node in a web of small systems. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the anticipation spread through his muscles. Beside him, a tall insectoid cadet clicked her mandibles nervously and whispered that she hoped the instructors would at least allow pre-packaged nutrient blocks. Another cadet, a compact mammalian alien with bristled fur, muttered that as long as he could boil water, he would manage. Mark heard the words but did not respond. He studied the drone instead, counting the pots, measuring their apparent volume, noting the thickness of the sides and the color of the metal. The surface had a faint bluish tint, suggesting a high melting point alloy. That meant he could push the temperature fairly high without warping it, which in turn opened up more advanced options. Instructor Vesha continued, her tone cool and precise. Your assignment is simple to describe and difficult to achieve. Over the next cycle, you must use your pot to secure food, obtain safe drinking water, and demonstrate at least one additional application of significant survival value. I do not want to see you boil sludge and call it a meal. I do not want to see you warm your hands over an open flame and declare yourself safe. Show me you can take minimal gear and build a system. Her gaze swept across the rows. For a moment, her eyes met Mark's. He held her stare, not challengingly, but with a quiet steadiness. He knew she had read his file, knew she expected something unusual from the human. The corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close to acknowledgement, before her attention moved on. Some of you will fail, she said without drama, simply admitting the reality. Some of you will treat this pot as a bowl and nothing more. Those cadets will go hungry. Some of you will burn your food, waste your fuel, and lose time. Those cadets will learn what it means to mismanage resources. A very small number of you will recognize that this exercise is not about the pot at all. It is about your ability to see beyond the obvious function of an object. She paused, letting the words hang in the thin air. Mark felt several cadets shift, as if the weight of the pot they did not yet hold had already settled into their hands. The drone lowered itself slightly, aligning with the first row. Another smaller drone zipped down the line, projecting hollow displays over each cadet's wrist console, showing the boundaries of the survival zones that waited outside the main training habitat. Rocky ravines, sparse scrub plains, a few patches of stunted forest, and a trickle of water sources. The environment was marginal but not impossible. It reminded Mark of upland basins he had hiked in back on Earth, places where the air had been sharp enough to sting his lungs and every liter of water had felt like a gift. He studied the topographic contours, the small blue squares indicating potential streams or seepage points, and began mentally arranging the steps he would take the moment the exercise began. When his turn came, the distribution drone hovered in front of him and extended a metallic arm. The pot detached from the main cluster with a soft click and drifted toward his chest, held in a gentle magnetic field. Up close, it looked even more solid, the rim slightly flared, the base flat and thick. No handles, which meant he would have to improvise grips or use cloth and green branches to move it off the fire. That was fine. He reached out and wrapped his fingers around the cool metal. The weight settled into his hands with a reassuring solidity. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice in the back of his mind, telling him that a good pot was worth more than a dozen gadgets in the wild. Around him, other cadets accepted their pots with varying degrees of grace. Some held the metal at arm's length, as if it might explode. Others balanced it awkwardly against their chests, obviously annoyed by the weight. One scaled cadet peered inside his pot with open disappointment, grumbling that the alloy did not even include integrated circuitry. Mark glanced sideways and saw confusion in more than one pair of eyes. To many of his classmates, survival meant technology. Sealed rations, filtration tablets, multi-purpose knives carved from exotic composites. The idea that a single unadorned pot could do more than boil water clearly felt alien to them. Instructor Vesha waited until the last cadet had received a pot, then raised her hand again. "From this point on," she announced, "you are under evaluation. Your actions will be monitored, your choices recorded. You will move to your designated zones and remain within them unless given explicit permission to relocate. You will have one cycle to demonstrate your capability. Remember, ingenuity is not optional. It is the difference between prolonged suffering and efficient adaptation." She looked over the circle of cadets, her expression hard, but not cruel. "This is not a contest of brute endurance. It is a test of how you think." Mark slid the pot's rim under his arm and held it against his side, freeing one hand to adjust his pack. The metal was cold against his uniform, but he knew that before long it would smell of smoke and resin and whatever else he ran through it. He felt a small flicker of excitement under the steady calm he had forced into his breathing. Challenges like this were why he had come here in the first place. Back home, survival training had often been reduced to formula. Follow these steps, use these tools, achieve this outcome. Here, the rules were harsher and cleaner. One object, one environment. Everything else depended on the person. The courtyard gates began to open, heavy doors sliding apart with a low rumble that vibrated through the stone underfoot. Beyond the threshold, the training terrain stretched out under a pale sky, a patchwork of ridges, gullies, and sparse vegetation. The air outside shimmered faintly where the environmental shields thinned, revealing hints of the gas giant's swirling bands in the distant sky. Groups of cadets started to move, each cluster marking out a path toward a different zone, chatter rising and falling as they speculated about water sources, shelter, and the best way to conserve energy. Mark did not rush. He watched the flow of bodies and picked a moment when the crowd thinned, then stepped forward with purposeful, unhurried strides. As he passed under the arch of the gate, the artificial gravity fluctuated ever so slightly, a reminder that the academy existed in the knife-edge balance between vacuum and barely tamed wilderness. He tightened his grip on the pot, feeling its reassuring weight, and let his mind move fully into planning mode. In a few hours, each cadet would stand alone with exactly the same piece of metal. Most of them would treat it as a container. He intended to treat it as the heart of an entire little world. Mark descended the shallow slope beyond the courtyard gates and entered the assigned training zone, letting the metallic hum of the academy fade behind him. The terrain took shape as he moved. Low scrub scattered between jagged outcrops, patches of tough grass whispering in the cold breeze, and dust fine enough to cling to his boots with every step. The sky felt larger here, washed pale by high-altitude glare, and the faint silhouette of the gas giant loomed across the horizon like a reminder that the world he walked on was no more than a fragile platform suspended in orbit. He paused long enough to orient himself, lifting his wrist console to check the projected map. His zone curved along a bend of rocky ridges, with a depression near the center that looked promising for water. He tightened his grip on the pot pressed against his side and chose a direct path toward the dip in the terrain. Every survival instinct he had learned over the years told him the same thing: secure water first. A person could improvise food, shelter, and even fire under the right conditions, but water was the clock ticking behind every decision. The alien cadets he had seen earlier would probably start with food or shelter, assuming the shielded environment made dehydration a distant threat. But the Academy's habitats were deceptive. The air was thin, the solar radiation was intense, and physical exertion would burn moisture fast. If he waited too long, the challenge might turn harsher than expected. He moved steadily until the rocky ground loosened into softer soil, and the faint smell of damp minerals drifted up on the wind. At first glance, the depression seemed dry, but as he knelt and brushed aside the surface grit with his fingers, he felt the subtle coolness beneath. Moisture lay just below the crust. That meant underground seepage, possibly from a vein running through the ridge. With a pot in hand, he could coax that hidden water out. Mark stood and scanned the area for a suitable spot. A fallen trunk, hollowed by time but still sturdy, leaned against a cluster of rocks. Perfect. He retrieved it, broke away the brittle sections, and carried a half-cylinder of wood to the shallow pit. Next, he collected a bundle of dry grass and a handful of small stones. Kneeling again, he dug a narrow trench, not deep but long enough to guide water vapor. He packed the grass at one end, placed the stones inside the wooden half-tube, and set the pot at the far end, angled slightly downward. He worked calmly, methodically, his mind narrowing to the simple priorities of function. The Academy encouraged high-tech solutions, and many cadets would likely attempt to filter water through fabric or trust their built-in ration tablets. Mark preferred older methods, reliable ones, born from situations where a single mistake could leave a traveler stranded. He lit the grass using friction against a rough stone. The spark caught quickly, and smoke rose in a thin ribbon. As the stones heated, the warmth would draw vapor from the moist soil beneath the trench, carrying it through the tube to condense on the cool metal of the pot. Slow, but effective. He sat back on his heels and waited. Patience was a survival tool just as important as the pot itself. The wind rustled through the sparse vegetation, carrying with it the faint metallic taste of the shielded atmosphere. He could hear distant sounds, voices, shuffling steps, clanging metal, suggesting other cadets were already rushing to set up rudimentary camps. Mark remained still, watching the thin mist form inside the pot as droplets began to gather. The first trickle slid down the metal and pooled at the bottom, clear and free of contaminants. He smiled faintly. Water secured. Once he collected enough for a small flask, he moved on to the next necessity. Food. The terrain offered slim pickings, but not nothing. He scouted with careful steps, staying conscious of every shift in the wind that might bring scents or sounds. A cluster of low shrubs with dark red berries caught his attention. He didn't touch them immediately. Instead, he pulled a loose strip of bark from a tree and used it as an improvised surface to crush a single berry. The juice bled deep purple. He waited several seconds, observing the color and texture. No sheen, no acrid smell. He touched a tiny amount to his lip, just enough to test bitterness. Mild, slightly sweet. That was a good sign. He plucked only a small handful. Even edible berries could irritate the stomach if eaten in quantity without cooking. He added them to the pot, intending to blend them with something more substantial. Further on, he found a few broad leaves, thick and fibrous, growing near a patch of greenish moss. He touched the leaves, bending them gently. They snapped cleanly with a wet crack. That indicated high moisture content, ideal for boiling. He gathered some and returned to his camp. By then, the sun had shifted noticeably across the filtered sky, casting longer shadows against the rocks. He assembled a fire pit using stones arranged in a half-moon. His hands worked with practiced ease as he layered dry twigs, thin branches, and handfuls of brittle grass into a compact structure. When the flames steadied, he set the pot above them using a simple tripod made from forked sticks. The metal warmed quickly, faint wisps of steam rising as he poured the condensed water inside. He added the leaves first, letting them soften. The berries went in next, along with a pinch of moss to thicken the mixture. It was not a gourmet meal, but it would provide energy, minerals, and hydration. As the liquid simmered, the scent of warm berries filled the air, sweet and earthy. Mark stirred the mixture using a flat stick he had smoothed against a stone, mindful not to scorch the bottom. He lifted the pot occasionally to keep the boil steady but controlled. The metal retained heat well, another advantage of the design the Academy had chosen. A rustle behind him made him turn. One of the alien cadets, a slim avian girl with iridescent feathers, stood a cautious distance away. She held her pot awkwardly, clearly unsure what to do with it. Her eyes, wide and reflective, flicked from Mark's fire to the tripod to the simmering liquid. "Is that food?" she asked. Mark nodded. "Soup. Simple, but it works." She shifted her feathers uncertainly. I tried boiling ration blocks, but the taste is unpleasant. I thought, maybe I should observe how another cadet functions. He understood the hesitation in her voice. Asking for help was not encouraged during evaluations, yet she was not technically asking for instructions, only watching. That was allowed. He turned back to the pot and lifted it slightly to let her see the consistency. You can use the pot for more than boiling, he said. Steam, condense, extract moisture, build layers in your setup. The girl tilted her head, absorbing his words. I did not consider that. Mark breathed slowly, letting the fire warm his hands. Think of the pot as the center of everything, not as a bowl. She nodded, clutching her pot a little tighter, then retreated to her own zone without another word. Mark watched her go, hoping she would put the advice to use. The Academy's challenges were demanding, and not every cadet adapted quickly enough. He turned his attention back to the soup. The leaves had softened into tender strands, the berries dissolved into a purple broth. He tasted a small spoonful using a carved piece of wood. It was earthy, slightly tart, but nourishing. He allowed himself a satisfied breath. As he ate, he observed the terrain with renewed focus. Once food and water were secured, he would need to think bigger. The pot could become more than a cooking vessel. It could serve as a heater for stones, a mold for clay, or even a smelter under the right conditions. The challenge asked for creativity, and he planned to push every boundary he could. He cleaned the pot carefully once the meal was done, using sand and a flat stone to scrub away residue. Clean metal retained heat more evenly, and he wanted the pot in perfect condition for the next tasks. He set it in the sunlight to dry and leaned back against a rock, letting his muscles ease after the steady work. The breeze had shifted again, now carrying the scent of heated minerals, the promise of ore hidden somewhere nearby. Tomorrow, he would begin exploring deeper into the ridges. Today, he had achieved the essentials. Food simmered in his stomach. Water cooled his throat. The pot sat gleaming in the sun, ready for every idea he intended to shape around it. The first steps were complete. The real work would begin next. Mark woke at dawn to the faint crackle of wind sweeping across the rocky plain. The temperature had dropped sharply overnight, leaving a crisp chill in the air that bit at his fingers as he stretched. His fire had burned down to glowing embers, still warm enough to reignite with a little coaxing. He crouched beside the pit, fed it a few thin twigs, and breathed gently until flames flickered back to life. The morning light washed over the ridges in pale gold, promising a clear and dry cycle, ideal conditions for what he intended to build next. He lifted the pot, now fully cleaned and gleaming despite all the use from the previous day, and mentally reviewed his priorities. Food and water were manageable, but preservation was the next step. Soup would not last long in this environment, and he needed something he could carry without worrying about spoilage. He also needed a way to stretch his resources without relying on luck or constant foraging. That meant preserving meat. A steady supply of protein could sustain him, but more importantly, it would prove to the instructors that he could create a long-term survival system rather than a temporary camp. He stood and scanned the terrain, noting the location of the shallow trenches and sparse vegetation. Before he sought meat, he needed to build a smoking chamber. Not a complicated one, just efficient. Smoke preservation required low, steady heat and an enclosure that allowed smoke to circulate without letting open flames ruin the meat. The pot would serve as the heat source and the chamber generator, but he needed structure. He walked along the ridge, searching for suitable materials. After a few minutes of exploration, he found a cluster of fallen branches, their bark peeling but their cores sturdy. Perfect. He gathered several long pieces and carried them under his arm, then collected a bundle of flexible twigs and dry grass to serve as binding and insulation. As he returned to his camp, he noticed fresh tracks near a patch of grass, three-toed prints, shallow and light. Likely a small grazing animal. He would deal with that later. Right now, the structure came first. He cleared a flat patch of ground beside his fire pit and began shaping the wooden frame. 4 long branches formed the base of a cone, lashed together at the top with braided grass. He pushed the ends deep into the soil to anchor them. Next, he layered smaller branches around the frame, overlapping them like uneven shingles. He sealed the gaps with clay mixed from a dry sediment he found along the stream bed, applying it with his hands until only a narrow vent at the top remained open. It would not be airtight, but it would trap smoke well enough. The result was a crude hut, waist-high and wide enough to hold suspended strips of meat. It leaned slightly to one side, but the structure was solid. He nodded with satisfaction. Now he needed fuel. Wood that would smolder more than burn. He collected a pile of damp branches and bark, carrying them in several trips until he had enough to maintain steady smoke for hours. Only after the smoking chamber was ready did he turn his attention back to the footprints. He approached the trail with measured steps, examining the shapes in the soil. The tracks were fresh, maybe an hour old. They led toward a thicket of low brush at the base of a jagged rock formation. He followed slowly, pausing often to observe the wind direction and the subtle tremors of movement beneath the plants. He kept his body low, stepping carefully to avoid snapping twigs. A soft rustle came from the brush. Mark slipped closer, peering through the foliage. A small quadruped stood there, its hide patterned with mottled brown and gray. It had long ears, slender legs, and a cautious posture, alert but not alarmed. It nibbled at the leaves, unaware that he watched. He needed meat, but he also needed precision. He picked up a smooth stone and weighed it in his palm, judging its balance. He waited until the creature turned sideways, presenting its ribs and shoulder. In a single motion, he threw the stone. It struck cleanly, and the animal collapsed without a sound. He approached quickly and inspected the body. The size was manageable, enough for several strips of lean meat without attracting scavengers. He carried it back to camp, slung across his shoulders, the weight steady and familiar. Back at the camp, he prepared the animal with calm efficiency. Using a sharp stone edge he had shaped earlier, he skinned it carefully, removing the hide in one piece. Then he cut long, thin strips from the flank and legs, rinsing them with a bit of clean water. The pot had served him well already, and now it would serve again. He filled it with a handful of aromatic leaves he had found nearby, crushed them, and added hot stones to release the scent. This would give the smoke a better profile, less harsh, more penetrating. He carried the strips of meat to the smoke hut and hung them from thin branches he threaded through the top of the structure. Below the meat, he arranged the damp wood carefully and placed the pot inside the center of the hut, upside down, trapping heat beneath its curved shape. When he lit the damp wood, thick white smoke began to coil upward, swirling around the strips and escaping slowly from the vent. The smell changed almost immediately, earthy, rich, and promising. Mark crouched beside the hut, monitoring the smoke and adjusting airflow by widening or narrowing a small gap at the base. He added more damp wood in small increments to avoid flames. Once he achieved a consistent flow, he allowed himself to sit back on a rock and rest. The smoke curled in lazy streams, wrapping the hut like a living thing. In a few hours, the meat would dry, darken, and become far lighter, but also far more durable. As he waited, he heard a soft crunch behind him. He turned to see a young reptilian cadet watching the smoke hut with wide amber eyes. The cadet's scales shimmered faintly in the sunlight, and he clutched his pot the way a child might hold a shield. "That device," the cadet said slowly, gesturing with one clawed hand. "Is it cooking?" "Not exactly," Mark replied. "It's smoking the meat, preserving it." The cadet blinked, puzzled. "Preserving? For what reason? The evaluation lasts only one cycle." "Because preserved food means stability," Mark said. "I won't need to hunt again tomorrow unless I choose to." The reptilian cadet tilted his head. "Your method is unfamiliar." Mark smiled faintly. "It's an old approach. Where I come from, preservation mattered long before refrigeration existed." Refrigeration? The cadet repeated, clearly unfamiliar with the word. Mark almost laughed, not unkindly, just amused by how differently cultures treated survival. The cadet hesitated, then lifted his pot. I boiled roots. I attempted to soften them. The flavor is unpleasant. Roots can be tough unless you soak them first, Mark said. Or grind them. Grind, the cadet echoed again, into paste or powder. Use stones. The reptilian cadet absorbed the advice with a slow, thoughtful expression. Your approach is more complex. You build processes. That's the idea, Mark said. One tool, many uses. The cadet gave a small bow, a gesture of respect, judging by his posture, and walked back to his zone. Mark watched him go, hoping he would experiment rather than panic. The instructors would not punish attempts, only inaction. He checked the meat again. The strips had already begun to darken, the edges curling slightly as the smoke worked its way through the flesh. He added another handful of damp bark, ensuring the smoke stayed thick and cool. The scent carried faintly on the wind, drifting across the zone. Some cadets might smell it, some might even follow it. But the academy permitted observation. What mattered was who acted. The sun crept across the sky, stretching shadows into long fingers. After several hours, the meat was ready, firm but not brittle, darkened and fragrant. He removed each strip carefully and laid them out to cool on a flat rock. They felt lighter now, preserved and safe to store. He tasted a piece, smoky, salty from its own minerals, and surprisingly tender. Good. Enough for more than one day. He cleaned the pot again, polishing the inside with sand until it shone. He liked to keep his tools in perfect order. Clean metal meant predictable heat distribution. Predictable tools meant fewer surprises. As sunset deepened, he sat beside the smoking hut, eating one strip and watching the last embers fade into darkness. The achievement filled him with a quiet satisfaction, not pride exactly, but a sense of momentum. He had moved beyond the basics now. He had built something sustainable, something efficient. He looked at the pot resting beside him. It had already served as a boiler, a purifier, a heater, and now a component of a smoke chamber. And he knew he was still only scratching the surface. He intended to push its limits even further. Tomorrow, he would begin testing how much heat the alloy could endure. The thought sparked excitement in his chest. The next step would be difficult, but rewarding. If he succeeded, he would turn the pot into something the instructors had not expected any cadet to attempt. He let the cool wind brush across his face as the stars slowly emerged overhead. The cycle was not over, not even close. The real challenge was just beginning. Mark rose before sunrise, long before the other cadets stirred in their distant zones. He could not sleep. Anticipation hummed under his skin, steady and insistent. Smoke still lingered faintly in the air from the previous cycle's work, woven into his clothes, clinging to his hair. The preserved meat lay wrapped in broad leaves near his pack. The pot, polished to a clean metallic sheen, rested beside the fire pit like a silent promise. He knew what he intended to do next, and he knew it would be the most difficult task so far. Creating tools from raw material was not simply an exercise in craftsmanship. It required control, understanding of temperature, and an instinct for when metal yielded and when it resisted. He also knew the instructors had not designed this evaluation with the expectation that anyone would attempt smelting. That made the challenge irresistible. He knelt on the ground, sifting through yesterday's scattered stones with careful fingers. He needed ore, something with metal content soft enough to extract under the limited heat he could generate. He had studied the terrain map, memorizing the signs of mineral-rich zones, discoloration in the soil, glittering flecks, unusual cracks in the bedrock. He headed toward the ridges, following a faint line in the stone where water had once trickled. Vines clung to the rocks, brittle and long dead, but the path they left behind hinted at moisture, and moisture often meant exposed sediment. A few hundred paces from his camp, he found what he sought, a shallow trench carved into the ridge where sedimentary layers had been stripped clean by erosion. He crouched and examined the soil. Tiny metallic flecks glistened under the morning light, subtle but unmistakable. He brushed away the top layer and found dark, grainy lumps beneath. He picked up one and rolled it between his fingers. The weight felt right. The texture felt right. Hematite, or something similar. A metal-bearing stone soft enough to melt with a concentrated fire, but dense enough to produce useful material. He filled his pot halfway with the ore fragments. The weight increased significantly, pulling on his shoulder as he carried it back to camp. The load was awkward, but the challenge thrilled him. Every step fed his determination. When he reached the camp again, he set the pot down on the ground with a dull thud and studied the fire pit. It would not be enough. To melt metal, he needed a furnace, a structure that could trap heat, concentrate airflow, and keep the pot suspended at the hottest point of the flame. He chose a spot beside a natural outcrop and began digging a shallow basin. He lined it with stones, selecting only those that could withstand high heat without cracking. He built a ring of rocks around it, stacking them carefully, leaving small gaps for controlled airflow. He mixed clay from the stream bed with sand until it formed a thick, workable paste, then used it to seal the rock gaps, reinforcing the structure until it resembled a primitive kiln. He stepped back, breathing deeply, letting the clay dry in the sun. The kiln took shape slowly, imperfect but functional. Once he felt confident it would withstand intense heat, he prepared fuel. He gathered fallen branches, dry bark, and clumps of resin-rich wood. Resin burned hotter than ordinary wood. He split the branches with a flat stone, creating smaller pieces that would ignite quickly. Then he collected handfuls of dry grass to serve as tinder. When the kiln was ready, he placed the ore-filled pot inside, balancing it on 3 small stones to keep it slightly elevated. The pot's smooth metallic surface reflected the sunlight, its shape deceptively simple. He studied it closely, gauging how the alloy behaved with heat. The previous cycle's cooking had already revealed that the pot resisted warping. If the alloy had a high melting point, it meant he could push the internal temperature far higher without damaging it. He arranged the fuel around the pot in layers, tinder at the base, thin sticks above, then thicker branches forming a tight crown. He coated the outer walls of the kiln with additional clay to trap heat and reinforced the opening so it could serve as a draft port. Then he prepared the final piece, a hollow branch he had carved earlier to function as a blowpipe. Concentrated airflow was essential. Without it, the temperature would never reach the level required for smelting. He lit the tinder. Flames licked upward, catching the resin-rich wood. Heat radiated from the kiln, pushing against his face. He crouched near the draft opening and blew through the hollow branch. The flames responded instantly, growing, twisting, tightening into a concentrated vortex around the pot. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the fire intensified. He continued blowing in steady bursts, his lungs burning, his cheeks tightening from the repeated cycles of pressure. The heat grew ferocious, shimmering through the gaps in the stone ring. He paused only long enough to add more wood, then returned to the blowpipe. The air around him thickened with the smell of burning resin. The fire roared. The pot began to glow faintly, a red that deepened gradually as metal particles within the ore melted. He watched for the subtle signs, the thickening of the ore, the slow collapse of sharp edges. His eyes narrowed as he identified the moment when the stones inside the pot softened into molten mass, small beads of metal separating from the rock. When he finally eased away from the kiln, exhausted, the ore had melted enough to produce usable material. He inhaled deeply, lungs aching. Sweat dripped down his neck, and heat had reddened his cheeks. But the hardest part was over. He let the fire burn low, then carefully removed the pot using 2 thick green branches as improvised tongs. The pot radiated heat, glowing like a captured ember. He set it on a flat stone, giving it time to cool slightly, though not completely. With a controlled motion, He tilted the pot. Thick, glowing metal dripped out and collected on a shallow clay bed he had prepared earlier. The molten metal cooled fast, forming a lumpy mass. He crushed the remaining ore lumps inside the pot with a stone, releasing the remaining droplets. Once all usable metal was extracted, he set the pot aside and inspected the cooling mass. It was rough, uneven, imperfect, mottled with tiny impurities. But it was metal he had extracted himself from raw earth. He reheated the mass enough to soften it and began shaping it using rocks as hammers. He formed a crude hook first, testing the metal's strength. The hook bent slightly but held. He made a scraper next, flattening the metal into a thin edge. Then he shaped a small wedge-like blade. It was not sharp yet, but it had potential. As he hammered, sparks flicked in small arcs, scattering across the ground. He worked until the sun rose high overhead, casting sharp light across the smoking kiln. His hands grew sore, his muscles tight from the repetitive blows. But step by step, the lumps transformed into recognizable tools. The scraper gleamed dully. The hook caught the light. The blade, once cooled, began to show promise as he honed its edge against a flat stone. Each strike brought it closer to purpose. He paused to drink, savoring the cold water on his tongue. His throat felt raw from the continuous blowing into the fire. He sat for a few moments under the shade of a nearby boulder, letting his mind settle. The tools rested on the ground before him, imperfect but real, proof that he had taken the challenge far beyond what any instructor could have anticipated. As he returned to polishing the blade, he sensed someone nearby. He looked up and saw Instructor Vesha standing silently at the edge of his clearing. She had approached without a sound, her eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of cooling metal scattered across the stone. She did not speak immediately. She simply observed the tools, the kiln, the pot still warm from the furnace. Her expression remained unreadable, but her posture conveyed something new. Cautious respect, perhaps, or astonishment tempered by discipline. "That," she said finally, her voice steady but softer than usual, "was not part of the expected evaluation." Mark wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "No," he admitted, "but the pot can take the heat. And once I saw ore in the ridges, I wanted to see how far I could push the material." She stepped closer, examining the tools. "You turned a single pot into a smelter." "I turned it into what I needed," he said simply. Instructor Vesha exhaled slowly. Not a sigh, more like a measured release of tension. She studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "Continue your work. I will observe further from a distance." She stepped back, but not before he saw something flicker in her eyes. A recognition that he had crossed into a level of improvisation that surpassed even her expectations. As she walked away, Mark turned the blade between his fingers. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. The cycle was far from over, and he still had ideas waiting for their moment. The pot sat beside him, blackened from the fire but still strong, still ready. He ran his hand along its warm rim. Tomorrow, he would refine the tools. But for now, he let the satisfaction of accomplishment settle into his bones. The pot had held, the metal had yielded, and he had proven, even to the instructors, that the limits of a tool depended entirely on the imagination of the one who wielded it. By the time the Academy's distant chime rolled across the training grounds, the sky had already shifted from deep violet to a pale metallic blue. Mark stood in the quiet of his zone, stretching sore shoulders and flexing his fingers. The last embers in his kiln pit glowed faintly under a crust of ash. The smoke hut loomed like a lopsided shadow nearby. His tools lay in a neat line on a flat stone. The hook, the scraper, the wedge-like blade, each one cooled and polished as well as he could manage with stone and sand. The pot, blackened on the outside and bright within, sat at the heart of it all. For the evaluation, he wanted everything to speak clearly, even before he did. He walked the perimeter of his little camp with the same eye he imagined the instructors would use. The water collection trench still functioned, condensation beading slowly along its improvised channel. A small amount of fresh liquid waited in the pot, gleaming as the light caught it. Nearby, several strips of preserved meat hung from a branch in the open air, dark and firm, no longer in need of constant attention. The smoke hut had done its job. The kiln remained a half-ruined dome of stone and clay, cracked in places but still recognizable as more than a simple fire pit. It looked messy to him, yet honest. The evaluation was not about beauty. It was about function, about the chain of decisions that led from scarcity to stability. He dusted his hands on his trousers and inhaled deeply, steadying his pulse. He had done everything he could within the time and limitations. Whatever happened next, he would not stand in front of the instructors wishing he had tried more. A faint whine reached his ears, growing louder, like a swarm of mechanical insects. He turned toward the direction of the courtyard and saw the first of the assessment drones crest a rocky rise. The compact machines slid low over the ground in a staggered line, pale shells glinting in the light as sensor arrays pulsed softly. Behind them came the instructors, pacing in deliberate formation. Instructor Vesha led the group, followed by two other officers in similar dark uniforms, one with slate-gray skin and another with a fragmented crest of bone along his skull. Each carried a slim data slate, and each wore an expression that promised very few compliments and a great deal of scrutiny. The assessment team moved from zone to zone, pausing at each cadet's camp. Mark could not hear the details of the conversations, but he caught glimpses when the group crested a ridge or passed through thinner patches of scrub. In one zone, he saw a cadet standing beside a bare fire ring, the pot resting crookedly in the ash with some murky liquid inside. In another, a cadet had constructed a passable shelter, but seemed to have neglected any visible method of water collection. The drones hovered, scanned, recorded, then moved on. The line of instructors grew closer, and the sounds of their voices began to carry in broken phrases on the wind. Minimal redundancy, underdone fuel management, insufficient long-term strategy. Mark listened without really trying to. The comments reinforced what he already knew. Most of the others had met the evaluation at surface level. He could not blame them. The Academy encouraged reliance on advanced gear, on integrated systems. Stripping that away had shocked more than one cadet. Finally, the group crested the last ridge between his camp and the rest of the field. The first drone dropped altitude and glided ahead, circling his zone once before settling into a slow drift above his water trench. Light flickered along its underside as it scanned. Instructor Vesha approached at the center of the group, her cape stirring around her boots. Her eyes moved across his camp without haste, taking in the hut, the trench, the tools, and the pot. She said nothing at first. She simply walked, letting her gaze travel from one feature to the next. The other instructors followed her, their expressions tightening with interest rather than dismissal. One of them crouched near the kiln pit, brushing fingers over the scorched clay. A low whistle escaped his lips. "He built a furnace," he murmured. Vesha did not respond immediately. She stepped toward the water trench and watched a few drops slide along the channel and fall into the pot. "Explain," she said, looking at Mark at last. Her tone was neutral, not cold, not warm, just open. Mark straightened instinctively. "I prioritized a method of obtaining clean water with minimal fuel," he said. "The trench draws moisture from the ground. Heat from the stones encourages evaporation. The pot collects the condensed vapor." The gray-skinned instructor nodded once, approving the clarity of the description. Vesha's gaze had already shifted toward the smoke hut. "And this structure?" "Low-heat smoke chamber," Mark replied. "For preservation. The meat is dried and infused with smoke to keep it stable for longer periods. It reduces the need for constant hunting." She moved closer to the hut, examining the cracks in the clay and the blackened interior where smoke still lingered faintly in the air. Her lips pressed into a thin line that was not quite disapproval. "You assumed you might remain in this environment beyond the evaluation window?" "I assumed I might be wrong about how long the evaluation would last," he said. "Planning for an early extraction is comfortable. Planning for an extended stay is safer." That earned him a brief glance that looked suspiciously like agreement. Vesha turned to the kiln next. Her boots brushed ash as she stepped beside the stone ring. The other instructors clustered around, more openly curious now. The one with the bone crest picked up the scraper and tested its edge with his thumb, letting out another quiet whistle. "You smelted ore?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Mark said. The surrounding ridge contained metal-bearing sediment. The pot's alloy held up under increased heat. I used resin-rich wood, a sealed stone structure, and airflow from a blowpipe to reach the necessary temperature. The bone-crested instructor looked at Vesha. That process should have been beyond the intended difficulty curve. She answered without taking her eyes off the tools. "We set the curve," she said softly. "He chose the path." She stooped beside the line of metal pieces, lifting the hook between thumb and forefinger. "You risked damaging the only piece of issued equipment." "I measured the risk," Mark said. "I heated the pot incrementally and watched for signs of warping. The alloy composition suggested a high tolerance." She studied him for a heartbeat longer before giving the hook back to the stone surface. "Your assessment appears accurate," she said. "The pot shows only superficial discoloration." One of the drones dipped lower, projecting a faint holographic diagram above his camp. Mark recognized some of the Academy's notation: resource flows, heat management, structural integrity. Lines connected the trench, the hut, the kiln, and the cluster of tools, forming a rough web. The gray-skinned instructor swept his slate through the image, recording the arrangement. "You built a microsystem rather than isolated solutions," he observed. "Yes," Mark said. "Each element supports the others. The preserved food buys time for repair or expansion. The tools allow me to refine future structures. The water source protects against environmental shifts." Instructor Vesha's gaze returned to him. Up close, her metallic eyes reflected tiny fragments of his camp. The hut and the pot warped slightly in their surface. "If I removed any one component, which would you miss least?" she asked. The question came out sharp, like a thrown blade. Mark paused, considering. "The smoke hut," he said after a moment. "I could rebuild it faster than the kiln. The process matters more than the structure." She gave a small nod. "And which would you protect first?" "The pot," he answered without hesitation. The corner of her mouth twitched, just slightly. "Correct." She straightened and took a half-step back, regarding the entire zone as a whole. The other instructors followed her gaze, silent now. For a long moment, the only sounds came from the soft buzzing of drones and the faint sigh of wind across stone. Mark felt the weight of the evaluation settling around him, but it did not crush him. It simply confirmed that every decision he had made was now laid bare. After several seconds, Vesha turned away. "Assessment complete," she said. "Move on." The group departed with the same efficient precision, heading toward the next zone. Mark exhaled slowly, realizing he had been holding his breath. As the instructors vanished over the ridge, he caught sight of two cadets standing at the boundary of their own zones watching him. The reptilian cadet who had asked about grinding roots lifted his hand in a brief, awkward gesture of acknowledgement. The avian girl from earlier tilted her head with a mix of curiosity and something like admiration. He answered their looks with a small nod. Every cadet here had been forced to rethink assumptions. That, more than his performance, felt like the real victory. The recall chime sounded later that cycle, resonant and unmistakable. Every cadet was to return to the central courtyard for formal evaluation and results. Mark packed his preserved meat, his tools, and his pot, leaving the larger structures behind. The hut and the kiln would crumble on their own in time, but their purpose had been fulfilled. The path back to the courtyard felt shorter than the one that had taken him away from it. When he stepped into the wide stone circle again, he saw exhaustion etched into many faces. Some cadets carried dented pots and ragged bundles of supplies. Others looked empty-handed, eyes distant with the defeated resignation of those who knew they had fallen short. The instructors took their places on the central platform. Holographic projections bloomed above them, displaying simplified representations of several zones. Mark recognized his camp among them, a small cluster of icons linked by glowing lines. Instructor Vesha stepped forward, cape settling neatly behind her. "The minimal gear survival evaluation has concluded," she said. Her amplified voice flowed smoothly across the courtyard. "Most of you discovered that a single object can feel like a burden when you do not know what to do with it. Some of you discovered that the same object becomes a force multiplier when you look past the obvious." She gestured, and the hologram shifted to highlight a zone where a cadet had built an efficient shelter and a clever system of support struts, using only raw materials and the pot as a shaping tool. "Cadet Arun," she said, "demonstrated structural ingenuity and energy conservation. Strong work." A slender insectoid cadet straightened at the mention of his name, mandibles twitching with surprise. The projection shifted again, showing a different zone, this one with a neatly arranged series of cooking pits and a small windbreak. "Cadet Sorrel," Vesha continued, "optimized simple methods to maintain consistent fuel usage and minimize heat loss. The approach was modest, but effective." The avian girl lifted her pot slightly in a gesture of quiet pride. Finally, the hologram settled on Mark's zone. The diagram of interconnected elements hovered above the platform, glowing softly. Vesha's tone did not change, but the slight pause before she spoke carried enough weight to make the courtyard fall utterly silent. "Cadet Mark," she said, "constructed a complete survival system. Water acquisition, food preparation and preservation, and the creation of durable tools from raw ore. He treated the issued pot not as a single-purpose utensil, but as the center of an adaptable network." A low murmur rippled through the cadets. The bone-crested instructor stepped forward slightly. "This level of improvisation was not anticipated in the evaluation parameters," he added. "However, the rules did not forbid such use of available resources. The performance is valid and exemplary." Vesha inclined her head once in agreement. "Understand this," she said, looking from one cadet to the next. "We are not presenting this system as the standard you must all meet tomorrow. We are presenting it as a reminder that the difference between surviving and thriving often lies in your willingness to push beyond the expected solution. Most of you boiled rations. Few of you created systems. In the field, the latter approach saves lives." She let those words sink in. Mark stood among the ranks, the pot's strap cutting into his shoulder, the metal's familiar weight grounding him. He felt eyes on him from every direction, some envious, some impressed, some puzzled. He did not bask in it. He let it pass through him, focusing instead on the subtle realization that he had crossed an invisible line in the instructor's perception. The formal announcement of results followed. A series of names echoed across the courtyard, categorized into tiers: those who failed, those who met basic standards, and those who exceeded expectations. Mark's name landed in the highest tier, along with a handful of others. The acknowledgement felt good, but not as sharp or thrilling as he would have imagined weeks ago. The work itself had been the real test. This was only the echo. When the assembly dissolved and cadets began to drift toward the barracks and mess halls, Mark lingered near the edge of the courtyard, allowing the crowd to thin. He adjusted the pot under his arm, tracing a thumb over a burn mark near the rim. A shadow fell across the stone at his feet. He looked up to see Instructor Vesha standing in front of him. Up close, without the amplification system or the formal distance of the platform, she seemed less like a distant figure of authority and more like a person who had spent her life in places far harsher than this training world. "Walk with me," she said. It was not a request, but it was not quite an order either. He fell into step beside her as she led him along the edge of the courtyard, away from the densest clusters of cadets. The ambient noise softened behind them. "You understand why your approach stood out," she said after a few moments of silence. "Yes, ma'am," he answered. Most cadets saw the pot as a container. I saw it as a capability. More than that, she replied. You built for duration, not for the clock. You assumed that the parameters might shift. That mindset is rare here. It is more common among those who learned survival before technology became a cradle. He thought of mountain trails and long winters back on Earth, of stories told by older relatives who had trusted wood stoves and water cisterns more than comfortable forecasts. I did not grow up in a place that forgave mistakes easily, he said quietly. She regarded him sidelong, then looked at the pot under his arm. You risked that tool to gain another. You calculated correctly this time. In the field, such risks must always be weighed against the lives that depend on them. I understand, he said. I will remember that. Good, she replied. Because this evaluation is only the first gate. There is an advanced track for candidates who demonstrate high adaptive potential. It is more demanding, less forgiving. I am recommending you for it. A flicker of surprise moved through him, followed by a steady warmth. Thank you, ma'am, he said. Do not thank me yet, she said. On that track, every mistake will be magnified. Creativity will be an asset and a danger. But I would rather shape a cadet who reaches too far than one who never reaches at all. She stopped near the outer railing that overlooked the training terrain. The ridges and gullies spread beneath them, already returning to quiet in the absence of cadets. Her gaze swept across the landscape, then returned to him one final time. Remember what you did out there, she said. Not the specific structures, the pattern. You turned scarcity into leverage. You built from one point outward. In the field, you may not always have a pot, but you will always have something. Start from that. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. She flicked her fingers in a small gesture of dismissal, then turned and walked back toward the central structures, Cape trailing behind her in a dark curve. Mark remained by the railing for a moment longer, letting his thoughts settle. The training world below looked different now that he had bent some of its materials to his will. Not conquered, not tamed, just negotiated with. He shifted the pot into both hands and studied it in the clear light. The metal was scarred and darkened in places, but the interior still reflected his face faintly, distorted by soot stains and faint scratches. This simple object had been the key to water, to food, to tools, to recognition. Yet in the end, it was still just a tool. The real engine behind everything had been the choices he made. He smiled, a small, quiet expression meant for himself alone, and rested the pot against his hip. The evaluation was over. The verdict was given. He had passed and had been invited to step through a more demanding door. Nothing about that future path felt certain, but for the first time since arriving at the academy, he felt that his way of thinking truly belonged here. He turned away from the railing and walked toward the barracks, the pot swinging lightly at his side. The metal rang softly against his leg with each step, not as a burden anymore, but as a reminder. With the right mindset, even one simple object could unfold into a world of possibilities.